As we gather here today, I think we are almost 100 of us. Equally and simultaneously, we have sisters, African girls in almost 13 countries who are launching this demand simultaneous today. We have Burundi, Cameroon, Republic of Chad, a Democratic Republic of Congo. We have Egypt, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Guinea, Mozambique, Nigeria, Central African Republic, Senegal, Sao Tome, and Uganda. So to all sisters who are gathering in different parts of the continent to launch this demand, we welcome you and we thank you for your support and solidarity. This session is being hosted today by Women and Gender Constituency and together with the African Feminist Task Force. So allow me now to introduce to you briefly the host of this session. Women and Gender Constituency, as most of you know it, is one of the 9 constituency, formal and official constituency of that UNFCCC, with the aim to formalize the voices of women's rights organization, feminist, and gender equality group who engage in the UNFCCC processes to develop and streamline and advocate for common position. Official members of WGC are 34 members who have official accreditation to UNFCCC, but also WGC hosted an advocacy network of more than 600 groups and individuals. WGC is the host of this session together with the African Feminist Task Force. And again, African Feminist Task Force, this is a group that has been formed mostly to advocate, with the long-lasting engagement of women and gender constituents who decided to organize themselves with the aim to ensuring African feminist voices and demands, aspiration, and vision are centered in the COP27 processes and outcome. To date, the group has more than 150 feminists as part of the task force, and the membership of the task force is open to anyone who identify as African feminists. These members of African Feminist Task Force, in their collectiveness, they are the one together with the broader women and gender constituents put together these demands which have been launched today ahead of COP27. To grace this occasion, we are blessed to have the presence of Ambassador Mohammed Afif, who is the Deputy Assistant Minister of Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International and Social Humanitarian Affairs from Egypt. He's also a leading member of the COP27 presidents when it comes to gender matters. And he's here with us and we'll be able to hear from him shortly. But with him, we have 7 amazing African feminists, young and old, from diverse corners of the continent, who will be sharing the details of the demands that will be launched this morning or afternoon, most part of the continent. And this session will be co-hosted by me, Mwanhamisi Singano, who identify myself as African feminist who happen to carry a Tanzanian passport, together with my colleague, Zulkiswa White, from South Africa, who is a WC coordinator. So to start that off, without further ado, allow me now to welcome Zainab. Allow me now to welcome Zainab, a young and fierce feminist. I strongly believe that Africa is safer in the hands of the likes of Zainab, who will put the context on why we are here today. What is the context of this demand and why this demand matters now? Zainab, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Mishi. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to be here. I'm Zainab Yunusa from Nigeria, and it's such a pleasure, the journey so far, being able to be here to come to the launch of this African Women and Girls Demand for COP27. Like Mishi already mentioned, so the group of African women and feminists came together that there is a need for us to mobilize ahead of COP27. We need the voices, the demands, the aspirations, and also the vision of women and girls of the African descent to be prioritized and amplified at COP27. And so some may ask, ask, why is the reason for this? How is it, what is happening in the world with regards to climate change? How is it affecting Africa differently to the extent of the women and girls? Now, for starters, Africa as a continent, we all know it accounts for the smallest share in terms of the global greenhouse emissions, which is about 3.8%, if I'm correct. And this is in comparison to about 23% of that of China, about 19% of that of the US, and about 13% of that of the EU. But Africa is there as a continent bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate change. And when I mean the brunt, what am I talking about? For instance, the drought that is happening now in the Horn of Africa around southern Somalia. We are seeing death. We are seeing the rainfall season that is now changing to the extent that for the past 4 years, the raining season have failed to show. We're seeing the cases of drought affecting over 7 million people in Somalia. We have also the case of flooding. We have flooding that is happening as we're speaking, even in north central Nigeria, in Kogi State. We have displacement of people. We have the fact that Africa is not even benefiting from climate finance, in that less than 5.5% of climate finance is going to Africa, even though Africa has low footprint and but is suffering more from the climate change. Now, why women? Why is this important? There's a UN statistics that state that 80% of climate refugees are actually women. So it means that displacement affects everyone, yes, but with women and girls in Africa, it affects us the most. And this is in addition, remember, to the structural inequalities that we're already facing based on our identity as women and girls. We're talking of patriarchy from the domination of women. We're talking about inequalities in terms of political participation, in terms of finance, that then translates for also to cultural discrimination and what have you. And so this is why African women and girls felt to avoid and bring a stop to some of this thing. In essence, in simple terms, if we do not do anything as women and girls in our unique identities, we will continue to suffer the most. And that is why we felt it was necessary that we come up with 6 key demands that we will then take to COP27, come together in solidarity, and then ask that this demand advocate for them in negotiations, in practices, in processes. And to sort of broadly categorize our demands, the first one falls around representation, leadership, and participation, which you're going to hear more about during the course of this launching event. Secondly, African women and girls are calling for just and equitable transition from fossil fuels. We're also demanding for climate finance, including that cover loss and damage. We're also calling for agricultural and land rights. We know that that is a very key value of African continent and community. We're also asking for just technology. And then lastly, we're talking about intersectionality and linkages with other work programs, because we believe that partnership and collaboration is key to our advancements in this sphere, in the climate space, and then to be able to battle and tackle climate crisis. So thank you very much for joining. I hope that you find the session insightful. I hope that you feel motivated and re-energized as we all prepare to go for COP27 and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zainab, for setting the context of why we need this demand and why now. And with that said, the demands are now live. My colleague will be posted the link on how you can access the demand. So we already have been given the 6 parameters, a broader topic of which this demand covers, but also we know now we have 27 demands in decision to have 27 demands, because this year is the COP27. So for every year, we want to address this demand. We have shared this demand ahead of time with the COP presidency. And I have said, we have blessed it today to have presence of the COP president's Ambassador Afifi. So I'll take this opportunity now to welcome Ambassador to share with us his reflection on this demand, but also specifically priorities of COP27 president, especially when it comes to advancing gender equality in the continent and in beyond in the context of climate crisis. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mishi, and good morning, to all of you ladies from the continent and from outside the continent. It's always a pleasure to meet with you, and quite an honor actually to receive this invitation for this meeting, which we are thankful of. My name is Mahmoud Afifi. I'm the Deputy Assistant Foreign Minister for International Social and Humanitarian Affairs. And also I'm a member of the presidency team preparing for COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Again, quite an honor to be here today. I don't want to go into more protocol or ceremonial introduction, but we always say in Egypt here that we would like to keep our focus on things, on the real issue in hand. Just a couple of structural points before I start my presentation on what's Egypt or the presidency of the COP is aiming to do when it comes to the work on gender and climate change, and specific in relation to African women's priorities and needs in this context. First, of course, we had this understanding that the issue of gender and climate change is an issue of vital importance. It's one of the main areas of work of the COP. And we felt that despite the work which has been done in previous COP conferences, through organizing gender days or having decisions or any sort of activities in this relation, but more highlighting should be there and on this issue and in a practical manner. We look at this issue as a phenomenon which we need to address comprehensively. Many aspects in this context, because we are fully aware of the gaps when it comes to the status of gender and climate change, including the gaps in relation to the status of African women. So we worked in two tracks in this context and tried as much as possible to have a structural and scientific work. First, we were able to have two tracks for the meetings, which we want to focus on different aspects, as I mentioned, of this phenomena. So we have a track of 6 sessions within the blue zone of the conference, which is, of course, I'm sure that you are all aware that this is the official track of the conference. And then we have another track of sessions for the green zone, which is open for everyone. So for the Gender Day, which is going to be on the 14th of November, there should be those two parallel tracks. The two tracks are not isolated, but we look at them as part of one process, one operation. We tried as much as possible to integrate all stakeholders in the work of those sessions as speakers, and despite, of course, finalizing the structure for the blue zone track, but we are still very much open, of course, to receive any idea on how to enhance it, how to enrich it, how to add more components under the themes which has been designed or designated for the 6 sessions. I'll go quickly on the titles of those sessions. First, we would have the opening session for the Blue Zone on Gender Day through a headline event, the Women's Agency in Climate Dialogues and Implementation, Win-Win for All. This would be a VIP senior level event with the participation of the main stakeholders from different countries, from the United Nations. Hopefully also we can see someone representing the civil society on that. Then we would be having a high-level panel under the title Voice of Women Leaders in Climate Debates, Policies, Implementation, and Beyond. This panel should be a platform to share experiences, lessons learned, and best practices on the objectives of the UNFCCC gaps. Then we would be having a third session on women and climate change finance. This session, we look at it as one of the pivotal sessions. As I'm sure all of you know, that the issue of finance is an issue of top priority, especially for developing countries, including, of course, African countries. So this is a session which we are very much attached to, and hopefully we will be able, of course, to bring speakers representing different stakeholders to point out their points of views and proposals on this issue of climate change finance, or gender climate change finance to be precise. Then the fourth session would be a ministerial roundtable for African women and environment ministers. It's under the title of African Women Climate Change Realities, Adaptation, Mitigation, and Response. Of course, African needs and priorities in COP27 is a top priority for the Egyptian presidency. This goes across the board, not only when it comes to gender and climate change issues, but in all different areas of the COP27. So we are going to have a specific session on this issue, the African women needs and priorities. And as I've just mentioned, it's a ministerial roundtable because we want this issue to be raised at the highest level possible. Then we are going to have a fifth session on the COVID-19 and climate change, women at the center of planning and response. Of course, there were many repercussions and retaliations and consequences of COVID-19 on the status of women in Africa and in other parts of the world. We would like very much to discuss in this session those consequences and how we can handle the challenges caused by them. Then the last session would be one on the women livelihood within just transition. The issue, of course, of just and equitable transition. We know how African women, or within the African context, how much we are attached to. It's a major issue to have an equitable and just transition, resilient ecosystems, especially in the most climate change prone areas in our continent. That's for the blue zone activities or sessions. And then we are going to have 4 main sessions in the green zone. Of course, I'm here dealing with the sessions organized by the presidency. But of course, you are fully aware that other stakeholders would be organizing other events, different events, and I'm sure that the WGC would be organizing one in the green zone. But for us, the presidency, we'd be having 4 sessions within the green zone on gender and climate change. The first is a climate dialogue, voice of women leaders of civil society. And we actually should be having some sort of a framework for through which we would like to provoke, but in a good way, discussions with civil society on gender and climate change issue. So we would be having some sort of an informal framework for that, which we call the Gender Green Cafe. And I'm sure that you ladies would find it, this framework, you would find it kind of exciting to share your ideas and experiences. Then we are going to have a second session on why climate change science needs more women scientists. That's also an issue of great importance. We have to discuss the role of women scientists and how they can serve the issues of adaptation, mitigation, and the equitable transition. The third session in the Green Zone is under the title of Women Leaders and Positive Agents of Change Within Climate Change. That also would give a good opportunity to share points of views as on the work, on the factual or the implementation work, the work in the field by different women groups and other stakeholders. The fourth and last session for the Green Zone is the one on the private sector nexus, women and climate change, because we found that it's quite important that we share ideas about the role of the private sector in the promotion of the needs of women, on how to work through different companies for that green transition, how to fill on the gap when it comes to the gender needs and the climate change through the work of the private sector. This is what I have concerning. I didn't want to go into further details on that, because we have some sort of a conceptual note for every session. But due, of course, to time constraints and respect for all the ladies speakers here today, I just wanted to give you a kind of flavor on what we have in mind concerning the two tracks for the Gender Day. The second thing I would like to discuss is the Presidency Initiative here. Egypt is going to present a specific initiative under the title of African Women's Climate Adaptive Priorities, CAP, African Women's Climate Adaptive Priorities. This is an initiative which aims to discuss how women should be treated fully as equal players in the just transition. We are in the final phase of drafting this initiative, which the presidency should be floating during COP27, and it should be opened for signatures by different stakeholders, states, organizations, women groups, private sector, everyone. We would be happy, of course, to share with you shortly, within the next few days, the final draft of that initiative. We already held consultations with the stakeholders. We had consultation with the women constituency a couple of weeks ago, and we asked for inputs. And we are very much open and welcoming to have, of course, more ideas, remarks, or additions to that initiative from the participants today. We tried as much as possible to have a realistic and practical initiative. The mission of this initiative is to promote the gender-sensitive perspective within adaptation, mitigation, and responses, to also leverage opportunities for African women within the just transition to the green economy and green consumption habits, and within blue economy in the context of achieving sustainable development, and to promote educational and behavioral change on women and climate change. We are looking for focused action areas, work in the area of reskilling, and including women in reskilling in the different sectors of the work of climate change. We are looking to enhance the resources for STEM. STEM, of course, is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. We are also looking for African women to benefit from the green entrepreneurship. We are proposing to have even a governance structure at a later stage for this initiative, one which should include different stakeholders, that should include women and ministers in different African countries, the ministers dealing with women affairs, and at the same time also environment women ministers. It's a multi-stakeholders approach where we would like this governance structure also to include civil society, to include private sector, to include experts, to include academics. Egypt, as I said, would be launching this initiative in the COP, but we would be very much happy and pleased to share the draft of this initiative in the coming few days. I don't want to take my intervention to more than that, because I think that I have spoken a lot, and Misha, I would like to give you the floor again, and I would be happy to receive any questions and answers in this context. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for outlining what the President has prepared specifically for Gender Day, and to acknowledge that we did, as Women in Gender Constituency, we did have consultation, and I hope the President will continue to keep the doors open so that this session will really reflect the diversity of African women as matter of participation. But I have two follow-up questions to you as now representing the presidents. One is the question of representation. Every year we do in Women in Gender Constituency do a report on the participation of women in the UNFCCC, and constantly and consistently African government has listed participants who are women. As the president, do you have plans to engage African government to get to parity when it comes to representation of women, especially in the formal delegation in terms of negotiators? That one. And second question is related to finances. I think it has been said over and over again that finances don't reach women, especially don't reach African women. In the Gender Day and the event that has been outlined, is the president engaging parties and financial facilities and institutions to ensure that there will be commitment on finance to advance gender issues?
Yeah, if I can come to that quickly, for your first question, if I understood it correctly, Mishi, you mean that the African governments are engaged in you mean engaged on the initiative, or in which context you mean? I didn't get that precisely.
So for the first question, I mean, when it comes to gender parity in the national delegation to UNFCCC, specifically COP, the African government are ranked the least when it comes to number of men and women who are attending the COP as national negotiators.
Yeah. No, I get it.
Is the is the president prepared to engage African governments so that at least we attain parity now that the COP is in the continent?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. Let me say that when it comes to us, Egypt, as the presidency team, of course, has some very lovely ladies with us, and we tried as much as possible to have a very solid and equal team from the beginning. Specifically, the team working on the gender and climate change. And actually, to be frank about it, me and my friend Amr, I'm sure that you've met him before, are the only two males in that team. So we find ourselves to be some sort of a minority here, but we love that status of us being minority, because this is an issue which should be which we find that it should be led by women. We try as much as possible, but this of course comes within, to be frank about it, within an informal track to enhance other countries to do the same, to integrate as much as possible women in their official delegations, their official teams. But of course, it's at the end, to be frank about it, it's the decision of every country. But we find, of course, that the experience which we have adopted as the presidency is a good experience which can be shared with other governments, and we still as much as possible try to promote this with other delegations and other governments. For the issue of finance, and this is also a very complicated issue, you know that there should be a decision on gender and climate change. That the deliberations on that decision started already in Bonn, and it's going to continue in Sharm el-Sheikh from day one. We, as a host country, of course, our role at the beginning is to follow on that decision, because there are co-facilitators to work on it. And to come and intervene at a later stage when we see that there are difficulties in going on with the main pillars of that decision. Of course, in this context, the issue of finance is a very critical one, because it stems, of course, from the critical situation of negotiations on it at a larger scale. Being one of the most important debated and conflicting issues of any COP. And surely it would be, of course, one of the main debated issues in Sharm el-Sheikh. We try to push, of course, to have a good language coming out when it comes to gender and climate change finance. Hopefully, people would benefit, of course, from the ideas which we are floating in the initiative, the Egyptian initiative, which I've just mentioned, because we have, when it comes to finance, we have a couple of good ideas which we think might be also a good compromise for work, especially on the African scale. I hope I was able to give some sort. I hope I wasn't that much diplomatic, but I hope that I was able to give you some heads up on the couple of issues you raised, Mishi. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thank you for joining us today. As I said, on behalf of African women and girls, we really commend your access and support in the process, and kindly continue to keep the doors open, as now we are getting closer to the COP, and the African women and girls are standing ready to support and making sure that the COP27 deliver for African women and girls. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. With that, now I would allow to invite our panelists who will deep dive on these demands. As it has been said, we are launching today a document that has 27 demands for COP27. And to start us off, I would like to invite Nada from Egypt, a very calm and fearless feminist, to speak on why is it urgent for African governments, but also for UNFCCC to prioritize representation. Nada, what African women are saying when it comes to representation?
Well, when we talk about representation, we have three different aspects. And of course, when we talk about representation, it's more than just numbers. It's meaningful representation and inclusion. And I'm sorry, there's a call to prayer now, but this is Egypt. So we call for equal representation and meaningful engagement of African women, and this includes marginalized groups as well, women with disabilities, indigenous peoples. And why is it so important? Because when we talk about representation, as I mentioned, it's not just about numbers. It's about bringing these priorities and these issues of African women that go unheard to the table. As Zainab wonderfully introduced, African women are at the forefront of climate change. And as Mishi further built upon, but they're poorly represented in the UNFCCC. Is it really bad? Okay. UNFCCC. So when we talk about representation, it's about having these issues on the table, actually addressing them. Because without them being discussed at the table, then we won't be able to really come up with solutions. And again, we have to think about, are the solutions contextual? Are they effective? And this is why we need African women. And we also need their knowledge and wisdom, which is something that often goes undermined. We need from the corners of Africa to really know what's going on the ground. And this is what these African women can give. And then we talk about knowledge and skills development, because even if the table is open for African women to join, is it really accessible? Are they given the tools that will give them the opportunity and capacity to really engage and participate? Because you need certain skills and knowledge in order to engage in this space. Even the language, the way that we talk about these issues are very specific to the UNFCCC. And in order to have African women to really effectively engage in the issues, we need to equip them with the knowledge and skills so that they can meaningfully contribute to the policy processes and the decision making. And then finally, we think about, okay, we need a structure for this to implement. And we have a structure. We have the Gender Action Plan, so under the UNFCCC. So we need to prioritize investment in it. Because under all of this, we have this structure, we have this entity, this system that we can actually implement from, but we need to invest in it. And we need to invest in it in terms of efforts and also financing. And this includes supporting the national climate change focal points, because we need to bring what happens at COP27 and moving forward onto the ground. We need to what's happening on the international level to actually implement it, to actually reach the women who need it, and to have that responsiveness and the inclusion and participation. And for that to happen, we also need financing. So it's a two-way sword. You need to invest in it in terms of prioritization, but it also needs financing, because at the end of the day, African capital, African financing is limited. And for it to really be effective, there also needs to be financial investment in the Gender Action Plan. And again, this is crucial, because if we really want to change, if we really want to address climate change, if we really want to have effective solutions, then we need to include those who are most vulnerable to it, and also acknowledge what possible perspectives and solutions they can contribute to. Because you can't put Western solutions to African problems. You need African solutions for African problems. And that can only happen once the rooms and the tables and the decision-making process open up to really meaningfully, inclusively have African women and girls. And this includes, of course, youth, and which is crucial because moving on, they are the future and they're currently the present. And this is on representation and significance, and it's a 3-point part, but it comes together all again to ensure that these issues are prioritized, that they're financed, and that we can really come up with effective solutions. Thank you, Mishi, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nada, for articulating the demands when it comes to representation, but not only demands, why is it important as well? To move to the next agenda on justice transition, we will not have the better person to deep dive on justice transition rather than Faith Lumoya, who is the feminist on the intersection of climate justice and gender, and climate justice and economic justice. Faith, kindly share with us what are the top lines demand of African women when it comes to justice transition.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mishi. And very happy to be part of this group today that will be launching that has just launched the African Women and Girls Position Paper for COP27. So to speak to you about just energy transition, a few days ago, there was a flood that happened in a place called Palisa here in Uganda, and it left communities' gardens completely destroyed. This was at a time when they had just faced a famine because of a long drought, and this was really a harvest that they were anticipating. So I like how Zainab started. When you think about African problems, they are so many, and the challenges that we are facing today because of the climate crisis are not limited. We face very many other significant difficulties on a day-to-day. And so it is for this reason that it is important to challenge all assumptions that what may be appropriate in developed economies when it comes to transition can also be applied in our context. The concept of energy transition, that the shift to a sustainable economy must be a shared global responsibility, and that its benefits must be distributed fairly across the globe, is erroneous, because communities in Africa contend with very many realities. In developed economies, when you speak about energy transition, it's really firmly rooted in reducing carbon emissions. And that's the main priority. But in our context, it's more than just reducing emissions, because for us, it's also about enhancing access and enhancing affordability of energy. Africa is, as a continent, is where more than 597 million people don't have access to electricity. And to even make it worse, almost 60% of medical clinics do not have access to regular sources or flow of electricity. So while the conversation to shift to renewable energy resources in Africa, as is within Europe and the rest of the world, is prudent, because when you think about it, renewables are largely affordable, particularly in the long run, but also evidence has shown that a lot of these energy resources are really invested in by locals. So domestic private sector, government is investing in these, and a lot of the foreign investors are actually not often interested in investing in renewable energy resources. So in our context, it's less about reducing what currently exists in limited quantities, and more about building a future where it's anti-capitalist, decolonial, and sustainable. It's about ensuring increased access and affordability. to sustainable energy resources. So as I conclude, and this is really in the context of some of the demands that African women and girls are making, is that, for instance, when you think about the legal framework within which will largely influence the conversation around energy transition, we see that developed countries, and particularly the Western world, have put in place systems and structures that protect foreign investors, that protect large corporations that are heavily investing in coal, in oil and gas, in fossil fuels. And so one of our demands is that Europe specifically, and all the other Western countries that are involved and are part of the Energy Charter Treaty should consider pulling out of it and also stop its expansion onto the African continent. This particular treaty allows coal, oil, and gas corporations to obstruct the transition to a clean energy system by giving such corporations the power to sue governments in secret tribunals and before commercial arbitrations, whose incentive is really not to protect the planet, but rather to maximize their profits. When we are talking about energy transition, as African women and girls, we demand that our interests are centered, that we also demand that when it comes to structuring this particular process, that there is a targeted and multidimensional approach that is adopted to ensure that the poorest and most vulnerable, who are mostly found in Africa, in small island states, in Latin America, in the Asian Pacific, are really centered, and that investments are in energy are really focused on safe and clean energy, so that we can be able to transition in a way that our access and our capacity to afford the transition is not undermined. We need renewable energy that is safe, that is clean, and that will contribute towards reducing the burden of unpaid care work, because we know that 75% of this work is actually done by women and girls. So in summary, really, these are our demands in as far as just energy transition is concerned. Thank you very much, Mishi. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Faye, for sharing demands. And I think that is one of the areas that we have a lot of demands, and thank you for articulating that. So to talk about the demand specifically on finance, and I know finance, there's a mix of finance and finance follows endemic, but now I would like to welcome Salimata to talk about specifically demands on finance, while Sylvia will be joining us to talk about the specific demands on loss and damage. Salimata.
Merci beaucoup, Michi. Merci à toute l'équipe des féministes d'avoir fait cet honneur de faire partie des panélistes pour parler de nos demandes, de nos revendications en tant que femmes africaines, les femmes et les filles. Donc, le financement, la première chose, et de manière générale, ce que nous demandons, c'est que ce que nous demandons de manière générale, que le financement des femmes en matière de changement climatique devienne une réalité, sorte de la fiction. C'est la première chose que nous demandons. Et la deuxième chose, c'est que le financement, tous les financements annoncés, tous les financements soient gérés de manière transparente. Donc, nous demandons dans la gestion des financements, mais il faut que ces financements aussi soient une réalité des femmes africaines. C'est ce financement. Parce que nous sommes dans des pays africains qui sont dans une cycle d'endettement soutenable. Donc, ils n'ont pas les moyens pour faire face aux pertes et préjudices causés par le changement climatique. C'est pourquoi nous pensons que les pays développés doivent mettre des moyens, des financements nécessaires, accessibles, disponibles, flexibles pour les pays africains et que ça soit mis à la disposition des femmes et que les femmes participent à la gestion. Donc ça, c'est important, c'est ce que nous demandons, que le financement arrive aux femmes et que l'ambition des 100 milliards qui est annoncée depuis Paris, on ne sait pas si on a atteint les 100 milliards. Même si ces 100 milliards sont réellement en deçà des besoins des pays africains. Rien que pour l'Afrique, je pense que nous avons des besoins de ces 100 milliards, mais jusqu'à présent, on ne sait pas si ces 100 milliards sont arrivés. Donc, nous demandons la mise à disposition, au moins le respect de cet engagement des 100 milliards. Donc, c'est important pour nous. Et dans la gestion, que les femmes soient au cœur, que les besoins, la situation des femmes soit prise en compte dans les modèles de financement. Donc, on donne des financements, on nous met en place des mécanismes où les femmes ne peuvent pas accéder. Donc, c'est important de mettre en place des mécanismes flexibles, axés sur les besoins des femmes et sur la situation des femmes. Donc, les femmes en milieu rural, qui n'ont aucune infrastructure, qui n'ont pas de route, qui ne sont pas alphabétisées, si on leur met des systèmes très compliqués, c'est sûr que ce financement n'arrivera pas aux femmes. Donc, nous demandons un financement disponible, accessible, flexible et adapté aux besoins des femmes. Donc, c'est ça l'urgence au niveau du financement. Le respect de cet engagement, c'est impératif. Le respect des 100 milliards donc, qui est là, on ne sait pas si c'est venu ou c'est pas venu, parce que les femmes ne sont pas associées à la gestion. Donc, dans tous les mécanismes, nous devons mettre en place des systèmes qui permettent aux femmes de participer au processus. Donc, de pouvoir participer à l'élaboration des critères de financement qui leur conviennent. Donc, c'est important à ce niveau. Et pour cela, nous pensons que tous ces mécanismes qui ont été mis en place doivent être réévalués. Donc, on doit les voir. Donc, mettre les femmes au cœur, que les femmes aient une participation active à ces mécanismes de financement, tous les mécanismes que nous devrons mettre en place. Donc, ça, c'est une exigence pour les femmes. Donc, que les femmes soient au cœur. Et qu'au niveau des financements, au niveau des gouvernements, qu'on puisse, surtout les gouvernements africains, c'est vrai que ce sont les pays développés qui doivent mettre en place les dispositifs de financement pour l'essentiel, parce que ce sont eux qui ont créé la crise climatique. Les Africains ne peuvent que subir. Leur responsabilité est très limitée. Donc, les pays développés doivent mettre en place les financements nécessaires. L'autre, c'est que les gouvernements africains qui reçoivent ces financements doivent mettre en place des mécanismes transparents, des mécanismes adaptés qui permettent aux femmes de participer normalement, de suivre la transparence et d'accéder à ces ressources. Et pour cela, nous pensons que les gouvernements africains doivent mettre en place des budgets, une budgétisation sensible pour tous les projets climatiques. Donc, que le genre soit au cœur des budgets. C'est vrai, souvent, il y a un problème de capacité de ces gouvernements africains. C'est pourquoi nous demandons le renforcement des capacités de ces gouvernements africains pour que ces budgets sensibles au genre et au climat soient une réalité. L'autre aspect, c'est les actions genre, qui sont pilotées au niveau des pays africains par les points focaux genre et climat. Donc, nous demandons leur appui, ces points focaux genre et climat, qui sont au niveau des pays, qui aient les moyens d'élaborer convenablement avec les femmes les plans d'action et aussi d'avoir des projets transformateurs au profit des femmes, avec les moyens qu'il faut, donc le financement qu'il faut. Donc, ce sont les principales revendications en matière de financement de manière résumée. Donc, ce sont les principales revendications des femmes au niveau du financement. Donc, qui cesse d'être une arlésienne qu'on aperçoit, qu'on entend, mais qu'on ne touche pas. Nous avons besoin de toucher le financement et que ça impacte positivement sur les femmes qui sont là, très, très largement impactées et négativement par les changements climatiques. Les femmes font face aux pertes et préjudices. Très difficile. Et nous pensons qu'il est temps de mettre en place les moyens financiers de les aider à faire face. Donc, c'est ça que je voulais dire pour les demandes, très résumées, donc, parce que c'est des demandes pour le financement. Bien que sur les 27 demandes, le financement prend 7 points. 7 points sur les 27 points. Ça veut dire que c'est important. C'est la clé. Donc, nous demandons avec beaucoup d'insistance que ces financements soient une réalité, que les femmes y participent et en bénéficient. C'est ça que je voulais dire. Merci beaucoup, Michi.
Thank you so much, Salimata, for outlining the heart of this demand. As you said, finance is one of the biggest priority. And as you rightfully said, we have 7 demands out of 27 specifically on finance. And to now nail down to loss and damage, which most of you know that loss and damage is not a reality of tomorrow, it's a reality of now. And African women need African government and the world leaders to address loss and damage. So to articulate what African women have articulated when it comes to loss and damage, I'd like to welcome Sylvia, who is experienced negotiator when it comes to loss and damage, to share what is the demand on loss and damage from African women and girls.
I just started this mission. Thank you so much. So good afternoon, good morning to everyone across Africa and beyond. From rural Liberia, I'm actually up north Liberia right now, where I'm following up on project activities, including village saving loans association scheme that target women and give them power to financial resources in terms of biodiversity conservation. So it is important to see how all these environmental problems link from biodiversity loss to climate change and how women are playing a pivotal role when it comes to addressing this. Now going to our demands. So African girls and women have demanded that the provision of adequate, accessible, affordable, flexible, and human rights-centered climate finance as a matter of justice and equity. So we're calling for accountability, for transparency, and for public funds to be delivered by developed countries. So far, our demands are picked up 3 specifically to loss and damage. So when we go to the first demand, we talk about this debt-free finance facility for loss and damage to urgently support developing countries dealing with loss and damage. I mean, right now, when you talk about loss and damage, everyone is talking about this stand-alone financial facility. It is important to know that parties agreed under the Paris Agreement to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. It is also important to know that our mitigation actions, our adaptation actions are so different from addressing loss and damage. Now you can avert through mitigation, you can minimize through adaptation, but addressing, that's the 3rd most crucial pillar for the continent of Africa right now and for African women. So we're calling for climate change to be viewed as this 3 legs tool on mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And when we look at the evolution of international frameworks, we say we've done something, we've measured loss and damage, we have an whole article dedicated in the Paris Agreement, but the pace is slow, it is not enough. We are demanding more. We got a Santiago network for technical assistance, but what we are saying is that what is important that we need technical assistance, we need capacity building, we need a stand-alone financial facility in addition to the existing financial architecture under the UNFCCC. And when we move to our next demand on 11, which talks about the funding modalities and ensuring that funding needs meet the most vulnerable group, we're talking about women, youth, indigenous people, and directing it to communities that are most affected. Now, climate change, the impact of climate change on gender is not the same. So while we are talking about this financial facility, we need to take into account gender vulnerabilities. Now, women access to resources, even in the field that we see, it's not as men. So we see these things stemming from historic gender inequities, from social cultural norms. So we need these things to take into account the problems and challenges that women are facing. Quite recently, Denmark contributed a huge sum of money to loss and damage. And then we see that a huge amount of that money is going to a German insurance company that subsidizes insurance for African countries. Well, it is good if we can have a political mileage in the negotiation. We are saying that we want this fund directed to these communities that are affected, and whatever activities on loss and damage should be shaped by the communities that are experiencing the losses and damages from climate change. So I mean, it's sending a message to developed countries on the need for a financial facility for loss and damage, but we need more, because it's just going to boil down to vulnerable countries paying for insurance for loss and damage. And this thing is an equity issue, it's fairness issue, it's justice issue, it's human rights, it's the entire thing, what feminism is about. And we are saying that it's not fair that people who's not responsible for most of these emissions should bear the cost. So we need, again, I will keep pressing on this financial facility. One of our demands also talk about protecting the rights of women and people for losses and damages caused by climate change, abuse, and violence. Now, when we talk about loss and damage, sometimes people think about, okay, how is it going to impact the food and agricultural sector, maybe infrastructure or supply chain, but it also goes beyond the vast spectrum to bring in non-economic losses. We're talking about non-economic losses on biodiversity, people, culture, and way of life, people losing life. We're talking about displacement and forced migration, which then leads to more violence against women and girls. So then you can see the links and how this facility or whatever discussions we have around loss and damage should take into account gender vulnerabilities, looking at women. So I will leave with this African proverb that say, if you want to go far, you go alone. But if you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go far, you go in a group. So it's time that we go to COP27 with one voice, no fragmentation. It's not about East Africa or West Africa. It's not about government or CSOs. We're not fragmenting anything. We are going with one voice. This is what we want. We don't want forced climate solutions. Local people, they have the knowledge. They just need support to actually put through or put forth real climate action. So it's important that we continue to demand for this financial facility, as African women and girls have elaborated, and we need to make sure that that facility take into account gender vulnerabilities, and not that whatever funding we get for loss and damage is not of solidarity, aid, or charity. Developing countries are not helping developing countries. It is based on responsibility. You cause the problem, you compensate for the problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. There was no better person to do that. And what I get from you is this finance facility is not a charity. We are not asking for charity. We are asking the developed country who have created this crisis to take responsibility to solve it. So thank you so much. And last, but not least, I would like now to share or to invite Gertrude, who left his bank job to work and establish organization working on agriculture, to share the demands of African women when it comes to agriculture and land rights, taking into consideration that agriculture is the backbone of the continent. Gertrude, what are the African women and girls asking the world leaders, developed country and developing country, to take into consideration as they head to COP27?
Thank you very much, Mishi. I'm very, very excited that African women and girls are standing in our power and asserting our agency to make all these intersecting demands. Agriculture and land rights. It needs no emphasis that land is the single most important resource for any economic activity, but more so for agricultural production. In sub-Saharan Africa, land acquisition is through two main channels. It's through inheritance or purchase. In a patriarchal and patrilineal society, both inheritance and purchase marginalize women and girls. Studies have shown that in sub-Saharan Africa, In spite of women and girls providing 70% of the agricultural labor force, only 7% own land in the legal sense, meaning that only 7% hold land titles registered in their names. The remaining 93% have limited, controlled, regulated access to, control of, and no decision-making regarding the land. Consequently, 97% of women in sub-Saharan Africa cannot make any permanent investments on land without due consent of a male relative. They cannot bargain for fair terms in the event of a forced eviction, and this is increasing by the day. Forced evictions are increasing by the day, with the increase in land grabs for extractive industries, for monocrops. Any compensation and settlement bargained between the male relative and the land grabber, disguised as an investor, will only take into account the male claim of ownership. It will not consider the spin-off benefits, such as the women and girls' claim for loss of livelihood and a need for an alternative place to practice agriculture for food security of their households. The male relative will very likely drink or gamble off the settlement money and not purchase land for his household. This must stop. We African feminists at COP27, standing in our power and asserting our agency, therefore demand that gender-responsive land policies that expand women's access to, control of, and decision-making regarding land ownership, productive resources, debt-free flexible funding for enhanced agricultural production and food security. We demand that investment be made in agroecology and associated integrated management of land and food sovereignty. We reclaim that communities have full control of agriculture, indigenous seeds, sustainable food systems, traditional farmer rights as espoused in the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for food and agriculture to guarantee food sovereignty. Thank you very much for listening, the audience. Over to you, Mishi.
Thank you so much, Gertrude, for sharing the demands on agriculture and land rights. And also to note that there is an additional, or the sixth subtitle of the demands, which is more on intersectionality as well as coherence with other framework. African women are demanding mainstreaming of gender in all climate action decisions and programs, but also they are demanding governments, local and national governments in the multilateral process to have linkages with other framework, being it CBD, UNDRR, or gender or generation equality in that matter. So with that, we now end the session on deep diving on the demands. I will now like to welcome my colleague, Zukiswa, to take on the next session of question and answer, but also to invite those who are watching us from across the continent, either to ask questions, share words, or just wave. So Zukiswa, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Mishi, Molweni, Dumelang, Habari, Alan, Bonjour, Bom Dia. What a lovely, enriching discussion. Thank you so much to the panelists, everyone that has been attending and engaging in the chat, and the journalists that have honored our invitation today. I do want to stress that there are 14 of our partners across the continent who are joining us for this launch of this demand and who are insisting that indeed the African Feminist Task Force is an idea whose time has come. I'm just going to ask them to please switch on their videos just to say hi so we see them. We have colleagues from Burundi, Cameroon, Chad, the Congo, Egypt, Nigeria, Mozambique, Guinea, Gabon, Senegal, Uganda. Just switch on your videos and just say hi to everyone. We're so happy that you were able to host these watch parties. Once again, to the panelists, I think we can all agree that the passion that folks have been contributing to this discussion really is a testament that indeed this task force and the work and organizing of consolidating an African and particularly feminist intervention to this ongoing crisis of our time is super important. Now, I am going to open up the floor to any questions directed at the panelists in particular. They spoke about essentially demand number one, for example, that we are tired of speaking about representation of African women and girls and not seeing it materialize in any meaningful way. As historically excluded and underrepresented communities, we are the ones at the same time who bear the brunt of this climate emergency, despite the fact that we have contributed less. We also had Faith speaking about the fact that when it comes to a just transition, the reality is that it is unacceptable, really, why African communities are maintained in a state of energy poverty when we know that most African economies and countries have contributed to the ways in which the rest of the developed world is able to have access to real basic needs when we don't have them. And of course, even the question around climate finance, that in actual fact, this 100 billion, which is still being failed to deliver on, is the bare minimum, because in Africa alone, we will need 250 billion to meet our climate finance needs to ensure that we are able to really fight back and resist against the climate crisis, and so much more that has been shared by our panelists. I won't speak much. Mine is to just moderate this question and answer. So encouraging questions, please do raise your hand or put in the chat if there are journalists in particular who would like to direct specific questions to our panelists. And if there aren't any journalists, I will open the floor as well to participants who might want to engage very briefly. Questions directed to the panelists. Is there anyone, Lindsay and Mishi, please let me know if I'm not seeing anyone so far, but the conversation is ongoing. Follow our social media pages, follow the web page where we will launch these demands and other interventions and opportunities for engagement. Also, folks in the viewing part, in the watch parties, if there's anyone who would want to ask a question, please just switch on your mic and go ahead. I'll just give it a few minutes. All right, I have, while the conversation has been going on, myself been putting together a couple of questions, and I want to perhaps start with maybe Salimata, if you're still with us, as well as Faith, right? To really speak to us about why do these demands matter, right? So this work of the task force, why is it important that we have consolidated our voice and put these demands forward, right? Why should African women and girls care about climate and these UNFCCC processes? And specifically to that, which is coming from the floor itself, how do we make sure that African women and girls are able to take the struggle forward and able to meaningfully participate and contribute to this unfolding campaign action during COP, and even after COP27, because we know that COP27 is just one event, an important event in terms of global policy making and decision making, but really, how do we, as African women and girls, take this conversation forward and our organizing forward? Please, Salimata, and then we could give it to Faith as well. Faith, are you there? Salimata, I think you're muted, but to repeat the question for the translator, why do these demands matter? Why is it important that African women and girls take the struggle forward? And also, how do we ensure that, African women and girls can really play a meaningful role in advocating for climate justice, especially as it relates to how it specifically affects us as people on this continent? Thanks, Salimata.
Merci beaucoup, Zuita. C'est important pour que les femmes et les filles d'Afrique s'impliquent dans les revendications pour la lutte contre le changement climatique. Parce que simplement, elles sont les plus touchées, les plus impactées négativement. Parce que déjà, elles sont dans une situation précaire, avec tout le poids du patriarcat qui les étouffe, et tout le poids de l'insécurité foncière, des pays, des soins au niveau des pays qui se réduisent de plus en plus. Et tout cela affecte les femmes et les filles qui sont toujours les dernières à être servies. Donc, nous pensons que les gouvernements doivent prendre leurs responsabilités, mais nous pensons qu'il faut aussi être à côté des gouvernements pour pousser les gouvernements, pousser la communauté internationale à appuyer les femmes dans la lutte contre le changement climatique. C'est une guerre. Je dis toujours, la lutte contre le changement climatique, ce n'est pas une lutte seulement, c'est une guerre que nous devons gagner tous ensemble. Et chacun doit faire sa part. Et les femmes doivent faire leur part. Nous ne devons pas rester dans nos coins avec nos problèmes. Nous devons porter très loin, accompagner les gouvernements africains, interpeller la communauté internationale pour que les moyens soient mis en place, pour que les femmes puissent enfin sortir de l'ombre et sortir des difficultés. Donc, nous pensons que c'est tout à fait normal que les femmes et les filles s'impliquent en tant que féministes et revendiquent leurs droits. Parce que je dis toujours que la lutte contre le changement climatique doit intégrer tous les droits humains. Et les femmes doivent être en première ligne de la lutte. On ne doit pas être en rade et attendre des retombées. Il faut s'impliquer activement pour que les problèmes soient réglés, surtout pour les pertes et préjudices. Donc, on est des filets de protection dans les programmes d'adaptation. Parce qu'il y a les activités de production où nous avons énormément de problèmes, mais que nous devons prendre en charge avec les moyens qu'il faut pour régler tous les problèmes. Donc, c'est un peu ça, l'engagement des femmes qui font partie des communautés et les catégories les plus importantes au plan démographique, au niveau de tous les plans, par rapport à leur rôle au niveau des foyers. Donc, nous pensons que nous devons nous impliquer pour régler le problème. Et les femmes font partie de la solution. Merci.
Thank you so much for that, Salimata. While Faith prepares to also perhaps come in, I want to prepare a question for, in particular, Sylvia, which is around what women living in rural areas. So what about women living in rural areas, right? Considering how climate change is particularly, relevant to their day-to-day. When we think about climate finance and research that goes into building resilience for these communities, how do we ensure that we are plugging them into that conversation, and how do we ensure that we're really creating a space to ensure that they're able to meaningfully participate and take some of these very clear demands forward around the responsibility of developed nations to ensure that we are able to really build resilience. So Sylvia, if you could attend to that in the meantime while Faith comes in to reaffirm why these demands should matter and must matter to us as African women and girls, and why is it important that the world rallies around these particular demands. Thanks, Faith, and then Sylvia, you can please follow next.
Okay, thank you very much, Zukiswa. So I think for me, why these demands really matter is, for a long time we have demanded that there is need for us to reimagine gender mainstreaming in the context of climate action, and saying that we need to go beyond talking about the numbers and how many people, how many women and girls and indigenous people and gender expansive persons are involved in climate decision making. And so in addition to that demand to increase on the numbers, to increase on how many of us are on the table, we are saying that there is need for a deeper analysis to be done in as far as the different proposals that are being put forward to address the climate crisis are concerned. And so what this particular position paper then allows us to do is to specifically and constructively say that we need to center the most marginalized. We need to center those that are at the front line. And then it's really providing practical ways of being able to do that. And I think it's very powerful, but it's also very political. It's a political statement in that regard. And it's really an instrument that is also giving us power to say that these are the different demands and this is how we really need to address certain issues and to address them from our context. And it's important that even some of the things that have been raised by previous speakers is to challenge the world, to reflect on how our history in terms of colonialism have shaped the way we are affected by the climate crisis, but also continues to shape the way the climate crisis is being addressed. And also looking at beyond colonialism, also thinking about how capitalism is at play, that, for instance, certain sectors that are really critical to our livelihood, like agriculture, are now really under attack, and that because of capitalism, we now face a situation where we will soon lose, for instance, our indigenous seed system, our indigenous food systems. And so this is really giving to us to be able to clarify to the world why, as African women and girls, why as feminists, we do need a seat at the table when it comes to discussions around climate, around climate action, whether it's with regard to climate financing, but also really re-emphasizing, for instance, when it comes to climate finance, that we do not want climate finance that will further reinforce that debt crisis that we're already in, that we want debt-free climate finance. And I think for me, that is why it's very important. And I hope that each one of us will actually use it as that influencing and advocacy tool right now going forward, and even when we get to Egypt. Thank you very much, Zukiswa. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Faith, for that. I will give it to Sylvia to come in on that question, and then perhaps Nada can close us off, specifically addressing the kinds of, so you spoke around how for the ambitions of the Gender Action Plan to be met, it is going to rely, for example, on how, to what extent we're supporting the national gender focal points. What might this look like? And also, as per the question in the chat box, how can, this support be strengthened to ensure that some of the questions you raised around what does meaningful representation look like are put forward meaningfully. Sylvia, and then Nada can close us off, and then we will be wrapping up. I want to thank you in advance for your patience with us. We're almost at the end. Thank you so much, Sylvia.
Thank you. I'm not sure I got the question. It's about how to include women in rural areas, right?
Yes, so it was essentially around how do we ensure that, rural women as the most affected and most in need of some of these interventions are able to be in a position where they can really advocate and ensure that, when it comes to climate finance, they are included and feel ownership of the struggle enough to be able to take it forward. So yeah, how might we bring in those voices?
Okay, so most of the work that we do on this side is actually in rural areas because they're like the biodiversity hotspot. And for a country like I'm giving in the Liberia context specifics. So in terms of Liberia, we have like 42% of the Upper Guinea forest. So we try to link forest preservation with climate change and the whole new trend about nature-based solutions. So most of our projects are within rural areas. And so, as I said, I'm following up on the VSLA right now. It targets women, it's for women. We like to hear women's story and how they can take full ownership of projects and their works, because the whole historic knowledge when it comes to these things. But also, what I also advocate for is how can we get these people to the global stage? How do we get local and indigenous voices at the UNFCCC process? Because they say that until the lion tells his own story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. We cannot tell the story like the way the people who are actually feeling the losses and damages from these things can. So I think one of our main points of advocacy is work that we should be doing is how do we get these local people to tell their own story? How do we make them part of the negotiation process so that they can actually voice out their needs and stuff? But as I said, most of our work, we target women. For me, I make sure when I said that's why it's important that women are represented, not just sit in the room, but also be vocal and be in key decision-making roles to make sure that women demands are heard. So I always try to say, guys, okay, we're talking about climate, we're talking about food system, but there's no cross-cutting issue on gender, you know, from farm to fork. Women are very engaged in this. So we try to, representation is very important because once you are up there, I think you empathize more or you understand more what women and girls face when it comes to all these environmental challenges. So I think one of the key areas we have to strengthen is how do we get these local people up there? How do they be part of the entire process that will benefit them? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Any closing remarks perhaps from Nada and Gertrude, and then I will hand over to Mishi.
Okay, this is Gertrude.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I had raised my hand, but now that you've given me this opportunity. So I would like to concentrate on how do we get rural women involved to supplement what our colleague Sylvia has said. One of the speakers did mention conducting deep analysis. We must acknowledge that there's a wealth of lived experiences in the rural areas that could inform policy formulation the way we want it informed. But we've got to make the special attention to rural women, identify the issues that keep them socially excluded. For instance, why can't they participate? There's heavy healthcare workload, a lot of things that keep them socially excluded. And once we've identified those, we are able to navigate these issues. For instance, language barriers, for example. It's not for lack of lived experiences, it's not for lack of knowledge that they are not involved, but we know that there are certain barriers that keep them away. So once we identify them, we'll be able to address them and we'll be able to bring their issues on the table. And by the way, the just climate solutions that are being conducted, that are being administered by WECF and WIDO, I think, are doing a great job to bring the rural women onto the table. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. Nada, you have some closing remarks for us on the question of support, particularly for the focal points, to realize some of the GAP's ambitions?
Yes. Could you kindly repeat the question, like, quickly?
Sure. It was really around so on the point of the national focal points being a key area which might be important for us to realize the ambitions of the GAP, for instance? How do we ensure that, what could some practical ways look like to ensure that we live into some of the demands related around that, to ensure that the Gender Action Plan is able to find a meaningful expression?
Thank you so much. I think one of the first points to make it important that actually like gender national focal points are not something that is present in all countries. So step number one was to make sure that it is present, because this is what connects the high level negotiations into the implementation on ground. And for that to happen, you really need to mainstream that this is the norm, that this is something significant, and that it needs to be incorporated in the climate change agenda, in the national climate change agenda. So it really needs to be mainstreamed on multiple levels. And again, the issue is not just being mainstream, but then we again have the issue of finance. So there really needs to be ensured, guaranteed finance for this. And as mentioned before, finance is a very big issue now already. The commitments made for the climate change fund is not being made. So there needs to be as well for this to really move forward. So we have the first step of making sure it's mainstreamed across all countries, having finance, and then to make sure it's really being implemented, we need accountability mechanisms. We need reporting mechanisms. We need to see how this is really to monitor if is it being implemented, and not only yes or no, but how effective is it? And we also need to look about how is it translating into women's participation in the climate change processes. So yeah, this is kind of my final points. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone who's joined us and engaging in the comment section. Thank you so much. Any questions that might have not been addressed, please feel free to pop us an email and we'll ensure that we're able to engage meaningfully. We are out of time, unfortunately, but thank you to my panelists once again and to everyone who has engaged. I will hand it over back to Mishi to tell us how we proceed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zukiswa, for leading this interactive session. And with all fairness, possibly should have this session for 2 hours or 3 hours, because like this demand really deserve the time that we have spent today to deep dive, interrogate, but also share what African women and girls mean by this demand. And in essence, that is why we have this session, because we could have launched them, we could just posted them online, but we feel that won't do justice to the richness of these demands if we are not creating space to talk about them and to reflect. So this is to encourage all of you. Demands Alive now can be accessed in 5 languages. Equally, the social media kits can also be accessed in 5 languages. So you have already graphics for the demands of amazing feminists who volunteered to share their voices. So, and I would also like to acknowledge sisters across the continent. My colleague Sukisa has mentioned them, who are watching. I see some of you in the screen. Thank you so much for joining this conversation. We know now with the power of technology, we are able to see each other from Burundi to Cameroon to Nigeria. So thank you so much. But my job is not to say thank you or to wrap up. That's the job of our senior sister, Priscilla, who will be here to wrap all of it, this conversation together, to highlight some key takeaways, but also to say thank you to everyone who joined this session, and to sort of like leave us with the key messages. If we have to meet somebody out after this session, what should we tell them, and why is it important to hold on to this document and use it as you see fit? The demands are unbranded because it's the product or it's the document for all African women and girls. So feel encouraged to use it, to publish on your website, to link it, to share it, and to use it as an advocacy document. So Priscilla, please, the director of WEP Nigeria, kindly now join to officially summarize the session and thank everyone who joined us and close the session.
Thank you very much, Mishi. Thank you, Mishi. Thank you, great panelists of African women and girls. I want to use this opportunity to also thank the COP presidency who has been able to join us. It's very rare to have somebody that is very busy at this point in time, preparing for all of us to be in Egypt to join us, to spend quality time with us, but also not just make a presentation, to talk passionately about the issues of African women and girls. From the panelists, we have some collective issues that has come out from each of the panelists. First and foremost, we talked about ensuring the issues of coherence, and of course the issues of African women representation, especially the COP came out very strongly. That is during, for the delegations, you discover that most of the delegations, we have very few women who are in representation, but that has come out very strongly during this panelist presentation, which I think that is something that we really need to emphasize, because it's only when we are at the table that we'll be able to talk about our issues. If we are not, it's going to be difficult for us to do that. The second issue, which I have seen that has come out very strongly, is about the issues of climate finance. Of course, we have the developed countries have talked about, ensuring that we have $100 billion every year. But how does that translate into financing of the African continent, especially of the women and girls on the continent? That has come out very strongly, and we are seeing that, of course, of all the presentations and the question that's come out is the rural women. We are at the rural girls. How do they compose? The African Women Task Group, Women and Girls Task Group, is working assiduously to ensure that no one is left behind. That is what the SDG has said. And that is why for the first time, the African women and girls have come together collectively. We are not just leaving anybody behind. We have come collectively from the Central Africa, from the North Africa, from the Eastern Africa, from the Southern Africa, from the Western Africa, to discuss issues that has to do with the African women and girls. And this, we are not just taking organizations from the national level, but we also have organizations from the grassroots women that have joined us in this crusade. So it's not just women at the national level, but women from the grassroots. We are looking at from the bottom up and not from the top-down approach. The other issue which you have talked about has to do with the issues of loss and damage, which we have seen that the developed countries have really damaged our countries, our continent, and they are not taking responsibility. That has also come out very strongly, that there is the need for us to actively engage on the issues of loss and damage. How do we compensate those that have been affected by the issues of climate change, caused not by our own continent, but some world out there? How do we respond to these issues? How do we account for this loss and damage? How do we account for these losses? These are issues that have come up. And of course, the issues of the grassroots women organization, we have a very worthy innovations that our women from all continents are being engaged. How do we amplify those issues? The issues of technology has come up. We are not looking at tech, we are looking at technology that is accessible, affordable, available, and of course, adaptable to our own communities and to our own continent. So how do we engage and enhance that indigenous knowledge that our women, especially the women from the forest, have, the women from the community have? How can we amplify those things, and how can we amplify those issues? The issues of agriculture has come up very strongly. These are issues that cannot be overlooked. The whole of women, at least 70% of the African women are the ones that feed the continent. And yet when it comes to decisions, especially in agricultural sector, we are left behind. How can we address those issues? That climate finance come to play when it comes to issues of women and girls on the continent in terms of agriculture? How can we also address the issues of women's rights to land when it comes to issues of agriculture? These are all issues that have come up. But most pressing, we are going to COP27, and we have the Charter of Demand. Our sisters, our feminists from the continent have presented eloquently the demands that we want to see our leaders, our negotiators take on board as we go to COP to negotiate. We need to continue to mobilize. We need to continue to amplify these our demands, and together we shall be able to take this thing forward. So I want to use this opportunity to thank our panelists, to thank Mishi and Zukisa for organizing perfectly, and for all those that have worked behind the scene to make sure that this event happened. It wouldn't have happened without all the energies that we are putting. Thank you very much, and thank you for our listeners. We have tweet. Please tweet as much as you can. Our demands are online. Share it to our parties. I mean, to our parties from our continent to the generality of the whole world. We need our voices to be heard. And from as many of you that will be at COP27, together we stand, and together we shall achieve. Together we will work to amplify the voices of African women and girls on the continent. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope to meet you out there, and let's continue to keep in touch.
Thank you so much. So with that, we're at the end of this session. We'll be meeting online. We have a lot to converse today online. As African women, let's own the social media spaces today. So if you're in Twitter, if you are in Facebook or Instagram, today is the day that we want to own that online space. And we have all the material in 5 languages to make our presence be felt online. So thank you so much, our interpreter. Our sincere apologies for holding you for the next almost 30 minutes. We can't thank you enough for your patience and your indulgence. Goodbye, and see you in COP27 in Egypt. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.
Tweet away.
Together we stand.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you. Bye-bye from Nigeria. Go.
Nigeria.
Bye.
Yeah.
We are all here with you in solidarity.
Bye-bye from
Kenya.
This is so nice. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Okay, thank you all for thank you all for being very patient, despite the fact that the